Um, I'm really delighted to welcome everyone here for this book launch celebrating the release of our colleague Sam Sakharov's new book, Democracy Unmoored, Populism and the Corruption of Popular Sovereignty. And it's our tradition here at the law school to host these gatherings when one of our colleagues has written a book that is as interesting, as provocative, and as timely as what Sam has produced. Let me just take a couple minutes to introduce Sam and his interlocutor, commentator. Anything else, Pratap? We'll find out. We'll find out. Okay, Muse.
My friend.
Friend, okay, that's good. Sam, as you know, is the Reese Professor of Constitutional Law here at NYU. He is the unusual academic who is both an extraordinary scholar in two different fields. He's a leading scholar on civil procedure, complex litigation, but he is also a scholar of democracy and the law. His recent works have bridged those different interests. He wrote the book Fragile Democracies, Contested Power in the Era of Constitutional Courts, published by Cambridge in 2015, not long after he had been the reporter for the American Law Institute's Principles of the Law of Aggregate Litigation. So he was able to bring his extraordinary insights to those two different fields. As someone who teaches procedure and also teaches complex litigation, one of the things I've always loved about Sam is that I now know how the different interests have interacted and reinforced each other, and perhaps we may get a bit of that today. Joining us this evening is Pratap Bhanu Mehta. He is currently the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton. He has previously taught at Harvard, at Ashoka University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and of course he's also been a global faculty member here at NYU. His scholarship has also been published widely in the areas of political theory, history of ideas, constitutional law of India, and politics in India, and he is the author of The Burden of Democracy, published by Penguin. Before we get underway, I just wanted to say a few words about the book. So I actually found the book to be both chilling, but with a glimmer of hope in there as well. I was joking with Sam, looking for the glimmer of hope as I was reading the book. And the book really does focus on the relationship between populism and a democratic society. It traces, in some ways, the history of an idea as well as the history of the post-World War II period, where we moved from what seemed like a relatively stable understanding of institutions and governance to what seems like a much more unstable moment. And those insights from Sam are then followed by a bracing description of the current moment. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Sam and Pratap.
Thank you, Troy. It's our custom here at NYU that the authors don't present, and I'm going to deviate from that because I've known Pratap for 20 years or so, and I'm actually more interested in what he has to say than what I have to say. So I want to relieve him of the burden of presenting the book, and so I will give an outline of it. There are many people in this room that I should thank. I have people who've been students of mine, people who both been students of mine and worked on the book, many colleagues who have been interlocutors over the years. I will forego all that. I will just thank one person, and it's a great pleasure that my mother's here. And, from the poor immigrant quarters of Buenos Aires to a place like this in one lifetime is really quite an achievement, so thanks,
A long
Mom.
life.
Long lifetime, yeah. It took a while to get out of Argentina, but we got out. So let me turn to just a brief outline of what the book is about. There's three basic parts to the book. And the first one, as Troy mentioned, is sort of the state of the world where we are and how we got here. And this part of the book is actually a product, in part, or the seeds were planted, when we did a talk in this room about 7 years ago on an earlier book of mine, Fragile Democracies. And the interlocutor then was Ira Katznelson, the great Columbia political scientist. And Ira posed the question, which was, is there really such a thing as a fragile democracy? Or are democracies inherently fragile in some way that manifests itself from time to time? And that question really threw me. I was writing about the post-'89 fourth wave, as it's called, of democratization, and I didn't really have an answer to, is this distinctive in this period, or is this something that we see come and go through democratic society? So in some ways, this book is a response to that question, and obviously, Pratap, that puts the pressure on you to come up with something equally insightful. And so this is a response. The first part of the book is really a response to that. What was it that established democratic ascendancy in the period that I call the period of democratic triumphalism, basically the 19th and 20th century, and what is it that were the hallmarks of democracy triumphing over fascism, communism, its 20th century rivals? And for me, it was a combination of a few things. First, and the book is heavily influenced by economic considerations, it was simply the material advances of the democratic world outstripped everything that could be produced by one of its rival forms of social organization. The second was that democracies developed institutions, and this goes back to Tocqueville's great insight about the United States in its early days, developed institutions that allowed for citizens to be part of something, to be solidaristic. There were civic associations, there were trade unions, there were churches, there were multiple churches. There were the ways of citizen engagement that create a sense of solidarity. And these forms of both participation, sense of belonging, and economic improvement, on my telling, all have been eroded, reversed, or challenged in some fashion. I use in the book a very fine graph produced by the World Bank called the elephant curve, famous elephant curve, which shows that in the period leading up to 2000, to the financial crisis of 2008, you had a dramatic shift in wealth in the world toward the less developed countries, from the more advanced to the less developed countries, something which as a normative matter I applaud wholly. But it had the effect of hitting one particular group in not being able to advance during that period. And that group, if you look at the curve, it dips in one place, and it dips at around the 65th percentile of world income, which is more or less where you find the working classes of the advanced industrial countries. And increasingly, they got left behind. Their economic foundations of being part of a labor movement, being part of stable farming communities, being part of a materially advancing society reversed. Second, they lost that sense of solidarity. We have now in the United States, for example, the highest level of foreign-born people living here that we've had in a century, from the last period when we had a big nativist reaction in the United States. And when I talk about this, I always have to say, I don't really hate the foreign-born. Some of my best friends, including myself, are fall in that category. So I'm not out to get them particularly. But these features of being left behind, finding yourself increasingly in a country where people don't really quite speak the language you do, where the food is not the one that you're accustomed to, where the cultural references are no longer the ones that you respond to, that's a challenge. And it's a challenge that then manifests itself in one of the critical issues of our time, which is the loss of state capacity. And increasingly, democratic societies just can't get the job done. We haven't built an airport. I like to talk about airports because and I have pictures of airports in the book, and I think they're really cool. But airports are a great example because they're complicated. You need zoning. You need all sorts of things. China can build airports. Hong Kong can build airports. We haven't had a new airport since Denver in 1997. Or if you want to bring it to a local reference here in New York, imagine that the highest output of our society is the Second Avenue subway extension. And imagine the cost, the delay, and so forth. So I use that as the starting point, which is that the populace found the world weakened. And then I ask the question, well, what did the populace do? And that starts, of course, with what is populism, which is a big academic industry of its own, and everybody's got a definition. And my definition is purely functional. I'm not interested in the ideological component of it. I'm not interested necessarily in the performative aspect of it. My take on it is that these are elected regimes that are deeply anti-institutional. And each of these pieces is important for me. The elected part is significant because these are not hereditary monarchies. These are not military governments of the Latin American style of the 1970s. These are, by and large, legitimately elected governments. They got to power under the rules operating in the country in which they live. I think the only election of a populist head of state that I would really contest might be the Chavez second election, but otherwise, the BJP won fair and square. Sure, there is a Westminster effect in Britain where an electoral plurality is translated into a strong parliamentary majority, but that's the Westminster rules. And we have the Electoral College, which can allow a popular vote loser to become head of state, but that's our rules, and that's what we've been operating under. So these are legitimately elected groups, but they are not political parties as we have known them. They tend to be anti-institutional actors organized around a personalist approach to power in which everything is concentrated in the hands of the maximal leader. I use the term that I am most comfortable with to describe this. I call this caudillo politics. Caudillo being the Spanish word for the military horseman who rides to the rescue, and caudillo is the correct pronunciation if you're from Argentina. But the caudillo mentality is one that then takes on the institutions. And the first institution that gets attacked in every single one of these countries, especially because they are elected regimes, is the electoral apparatus. In every single one of these countries, we've had an assault upon the administration of elections as part of the populist consolidation of power. In India, it was the move against the Electoral Commission and then ultimately the Supreme Court. In Hungary, it was the same thing. In Poland, it was the same thing. In Brazil, it was the attempt to dismantle the Independent Electoral Tribunal. In Mexico, it's the attempt to dismantle the two independent electoral organizations. So one part of this is the increased attack on institutions. And the reason for that the book argues, is that democracy turns fundamentally on two things. One is the idea of rotation in office. The idea that I can be a winner today, but I may lose tomorrow, or I can lose today and I can come back and win tomorrow. which means that there's a necessary sense of shared enterprise that the populists reject. They believe that they represent the people, and the people have triumphed, and it is the end of history as far as they are concerned. All they have to do is protect against the rear guard. And the second part of this is that it's not just repeat play, it's also a limitation on power. That power is institutionally constrained by separation of powers, by all kinds of limitations. And so what you see in populists in government is that they try to scale back independent institutional authority and allow for a maximum amount of discretionary clientelist power in the hands of the chief executive. Now, this leads me to the hardest part of the book, which is the heart of the second chapter here, second part of the book. And in my view, the hardest part of the argument, and probably the toughest part to read, is where I say, okay, what happens then when they take power? And here I am departing from what I had previously written, including in Fragile Democracies. Fragile Democracies was the one way of reading the main argument was that the way to protect democracies against fragility is to solidify democratic governance norms at a higher level of constitutional law, empower constitutional courts to enforce that, and thereby limit the ways in which democracies can fail. This book looks at that. I don't think I quite attacked myself, but this book looks at that and says, you know what, that worked for a while, but not for long, because the populists figured out what the game was, and so they took over the constitutional courts. They neutered them. India began this whole movement with what's called the Basic Structures Doctrine in the resistance to the state of emergency of Indira Gandhi. India's Supreme Court today, you know, you may disagree. I think it's a nullity. I think it's a non-existent entity. The only Muslim majority part of India, Kashmir, has been under a military state of siege for 5 years. And the Indian Supreme Court has accepted not a single habeas petition. Am I still right about that? So they've not accepted a single habeas petition from 5 years of military rule in Kashmir, state of emergency rule. So I start to believe that maybe it's not constitutional law, but it's the ordinary kind of simple rule of law mechanics of institutionally diffuse rights of enforcement of norms of normal society, and that's where the corruption point comes in. When I first started about 10, 15 years ago to spend a lot of my time looking at these foreign engagements with democracy, what I found was country after country, I kept coming across these corruption cases. And one after another, I rejected it. I'm not going to spend my time on corruption. That's not my thing. I'm interested in bigger picture. I'm a serious intellectual. I'm not going to play with this crap about this one took some money and this one built a farm and this one did this and this one did that. But after a while, it's sort of like, how can it be that I'm rejecting observation on what I see in every single one of these countries? And so I began to think that corruption was not a sideshow, but corruption was actually something quite integrated into the idea of what it meant to have weak institutions. And so I rely on a literature, a complicated literature from developmental economics about why it is that stable institutions tend to depress corruption and also allow for longer-term development. And the stable institutions don't necessarily have to be democratic. It can be Singapore. It can be a hereditary monarchy. It can be many things. But democracies have tended to be associated with lower levels of corruption. And that's why I started to think that maybe ordinary prosecutions, not impeachment, not grand constitutional courts, but ordinary enforcement of the law might be a way to check corruption. It's what brought down Zuma in South Africa. It's what helped to bring down Kirchner in Argentina. It certainly helped to bring down Bolsonaro in Brazil. And so there's an entire argument about how, it's basically like getting Al Capone on tax evasion, how maybe what you have to do with these kinds of threats is treat them as ordinary transgressions of law rather than elevate it to the constitutional plane. Okay, briefly, the third section is what to do next, and that's hard. And I tend to be of the school of economists who believe that if there's a $20 bill on the floor, it's not really there because if it were there, somebody must have gotten it already. And so it's very hard to write, here's my 5-point plan, and you do this, and and everything will be fine. Particularly because I tend to think that the solutions run against each other in terms of what the problem is. If you're worried about state incapacity, you have to unleash the executive. If you're worried about too much concentration of power in the executive, you have to constrain the executive through administrative mechanisms and legislative empowerment. If you want to allow political parties to be more forceful, you have to ease up on the money into the parties. But if you ease up on the money into the parties, you're inviting new avenues of corruption. So it's a very difficult undertaking, and I have a couple of concrete proposals, some to do with social media, some to do with other features of this. But the only one that I'll identify now, because it'll put me on the kook wing of the debates here, for the first time in this book, I come out fully with the logic of my position on campaign finance. And this is a place where my colleagues who I've written with on this and related matters, Pam Carlin, Bob Bauer, Rick Pildes, haven't come to this position yet, at least not publicly. And I'm looking at Rick as I say that. And the position is, it's time to take off all contribution limits to parties. Let the money go back where it's best used in democratic politics, and let's get it out of these other hands. So that's, if you want to take this down easily, that's the place to attack.
Richard just gave you the thumbs up.
And
So reconsider.
and finally, there's an epilogue that's the glimmer of hope that Troy referred to. I've got some notes of optimism that I want to convey. Not many, because it's only 3 pages, that section. And to be honest, I wouldn't buy the book for that, for those 3 pages. And to be more honest, I can't really talk about them here because that's to give away the punchline at the end of the book, and that would violate all the spoiler rules of the discussion. So, Prata.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. This is a very difficult book for me to comment on. One, because most of what I've learned about institutions I've learned from Sam. 2, it's a very artfully written book. Every time you think, okay, here's a possible objection or a fact or a historical trend Sam must have missed, tucked away somewhere, you will find a reference to it. It's a very complicated book. I mean, you actually do have to read it twice to kind of understand the richness of the argument. And third, because I'm actually pretty much on Sam's side. I think I agree with most of the argument. So what I'll do in good NYU tradition is take that stereotype about liberals that we should never argue our own case, and try and push, in a sense, the opposite side of the argument a bit, mostly to draw Sam out. That's the spirit of this provocation. And I'll organize it around 3 different themes, which will be kind of each bookended by 1 quotation. And the first one might surprise you, Sam. Yeah, so Edmund Burke, when he wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France, had that famous line about the age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded. And Tom Paine replied, in one of the classic replies, he Burke pities the plumage but forgets the dying bird. Now, one of the great virtues of Sam's book is that he does not forget the dying bird, as his account just recounted. He places the decline of institutions and our concern about institutions and democracy in deeper social, political, economic, and cultural trends. And I think that's one of the great marvels of the book. It's distinctive in asking the question not what populist ideology is, but what are populist technologies of governance? What are the principles of rule that animate a populist governance structure? And it's those principles that get Sam very, very upset. Sam is an institutionalist at heart. He thinks institutions are a form of authority beyond instrumentalism. They're a way of channeling power. They're a peaceful way of resolving disputes. And most importantly, in democracies, they are a mechanism for correcting mistakes. And in that sense, if I had to describe the outlook of the book, at least as I see the institutional parts of it, it's a very subtle combination of Michael Oakeshott, V.O. Key, Alexis de Tocqueville, with a dash of contemporary social science put together. Now, what's wrong with populists? Populists want to dismantle all of these things, right? They instrumentalize institutions to personal power or worse. They want to concentrate power rather than divide it. They want to create the conditions where institutional life no longer has, in some ways, the capacity to correct mistakes. You know, John Stuart Mill once said, it's not one of the faults of democracy to be obstinate in error. Populists want us to be obstinate in error. Right? And as I said, I'm sympathetic to this emphasis on institutions and many of Sam's institutional proposals. But suppose somebody were to hear this, Sam, and say, there's a sentence you have in the introductions where you say, look, one of the good things about institutions is they order society according to deliberative principles, procedural order, and compromise. I think those are the three values of institutional life. And suppose somebody were to say, is this really just at this moment in the 20th century with all the multiple crises facing us, a version of the Burkean lament of the age of chivalry has gone, right? Sounds nice, deliberation, procedural order, and compromise. They made life bearable for us. They made life comfortable for many of us. And yet out there is this large world that actually thinks those very institutions that had this enchanting quality of deliberation, compromise, procedural order, these very things are becoming the obstacle to the underlying fabric of social decay. And that all of us who are in some senses calling for a return to institutional life, right, are in a sense like people calling for a return to for the return of the Bourbon regime, its chivalry, its politeness, its veil, the veil it cast over underlying social decay, right? So that's one kind of sort of, in a sense, thought. Is this the social science version of we just all want a polite society where law professors can debate procedure, where politicians are a nice clubby club that, in a sense, just look after their own interests, while the opioid crisis continues, climate change has no resolution, social injustice continues unabated. So that's, in a sense, the first, I think, provocation. And in part, if you want to press this line of argument, you say that, look, even the account of what made the institutions that you write about work, let's take political parties, an institution both of us love and would dearly want to strengthen. But as you yourself acknowledge, the mechanism that held the classic political party for the second half of the 20th century in place, the three most important mechanisms were who controlled the patronage, who controlled the selection mechanism, and who controlled the money, right? Now, on first principles, these are all three very difficult principles to defend, right? I mean, Rick Pildes has written powerfully about the beneficial effects of certain kinds of selection mechanisms, right? But once confidence in those mechanisms has eroded, right? Once you see the control of money even channeling to political parties as a form of structural corruption, right? Is it now possible to, in some senses, go back and say, let's go back to, in a sense, that kind of polite form of political party? The democratic dam has burst. You can't simply now say that political parties will not be hijacked by these deep social forces from outside, and the institutional dams that we kind of create will be able to check them. Legislatures. Again, something absolutely dear to her. I mean, the dignity of legislation is something we'd love dearly, in some senses, to honor. But is the story of the last 30, 40 years a story of legislative decline? Could we not say that what has actually happened, more accurately speaking, is that the legislature is more deeply reflecting the social divisions and forces in society? The gridlock in Congress is actually the gridlock of American society. It may not simply be a case of, well, if you could reform the filibuster, if you could get some procedural stuff going. Courts, right? Again, an institution dear to us. But once the veil has been lifted of the partisanship and unreliability of all our Supreme Courts as champions of liberty and equality, is it going to be enough to say, let's return back to that age of chivalry where we all pretended the world was simply the Warren Court or India's Supreme Court for a period of 5 years, right? In that sense, right, I just want to kind of push you on that is there something too comfortable for all of us? It's a world we'd like to inhabit. But the social conditions, the conditions of legitimacy that made it possible, have actually eroded for exactly the reasons that you so powerfully describe. The second, I think, point I want to make is there's a wonderful line from Myron Wiener, who wrote about India's emergency in the 1975. And he said once that societies don't destroy their institutions, states do. And what he meant by this, I was reminded of this reading something, a wonderful speech by Abraham Lincoln in 1838, which interestingly was titled The Perpetuation of Institutions. I mean, already in 1838, this is, right? Where Myron's, I think, basic thought was that often we think of institutions as being undermined by processes of social mobilization from below. Populism is intrinsic to the logic of democracy. There are moments where people wish to take back sovereign power from these procedural forms, from these kind of institutions that we have built up because they think these institutions are out of touch, no longer serving their needs. In that sense, populism seems to be almost like a 20-year phenomenon in almost every democracy. You can look at 1830s, 1850s in the US, 1890s, 1930s, 1960s, and some 1970s. And one characterization of populism has always been that it's a threat in part because, as Sam Huntington used to say, there's this upsurge of mobilization from below, which in a sense the formal institutional channels can no longer contain, right? And in this picture, the destruction of institutions comes from popular mobilization, right? As Huntington put it, there's a mismatch between institutional capacity and what the population is demanding. But Myron Wiener's point was the opposite. He was saying, look, if you ask the question, who destroys institutions? it's actually not that popular upsurge from below. It is usually elites who are already entrenched in state power, who at certain points acquire incentives to destroy those institutions. So if we ask the question, what does the courts, does in the Supreme Courts of the various countries that you're talking about? One narrative would be, these were destroyed because there was an upsurge of populist mobilization. Another narrative would be, it is actually precisely the most privileged, entrenched ruling classes who were in a position to provide that resistance to an individual ruler trying to destroy a Supreme Court, who were actually the first to cave in, right? And I think a lot turns on what your diagnosis of who destroys these institutions actually is, right? Because at least in a sense, my reading, I think what facilitates the destruction of these institutions is not that populist mobilization, because that can be a generative product in renewing democracy. That can be a way of the people trying to assert their sovereign power against anonymous forces of necessity. It is what happens to the elites who are in a position to resist, right? And you paint a very nuanced picture. I mean, the part of the elite that you have more faith in is the ordinary judge, not the judge at the constitutional level, right? But we have to ask the question, what are the conditions under which those kinds of elites exist and endure, right? And what was it about the last 10 years that elite in country after country instrumentalized institutions to their own purposes? You might want to draw a contrast between institutional power and personalized power, right? That's a simple way in which we think of the destruction of institutions, as you powerfully outlined. That's what populist rulers do. They personalize power. But there's a subtler contrast, opposite of institutionalism, that is instrumentalism. I hate to say this, many of our colleagues, if you look at their positions on, let's say, the Supreme Court, on procedures in Parliament or Congress, their positions on those procedures is almost always a function of whether they are on the winning side or losing side of those procedures. The instrumentalization of law happened in the context of war, for instance, where elites of advanced democracies decided they are willing to instrumentalize congressional procedure, executive power, to, in some senses, justify and facilitated wars. So the deeper corrosion of institutions did not happen because a personalist leader came to power. The deeper corrosion of institutions happened because it is us liberals, in some ways, in a broad sense, who were already instrumentalizing those procedures and were willing to abandon. So suddenly everybody's concerned about the Supreme Court, term limits, filibuster, all those kinds of things. Right? And so the question, Sam, in a sense, is what are the conditions under which elites actually subscribe to a view of institutional authority that is non-instrumental, that is willing to say, yes, even if we lose, these institutions carry an authority that is independent of, in a sense, the ends they serve. And that's the Oakeshottian in you in some ways, right? That actually the form matters, not the end. The third and final thought, and I'll be just quick about this, which is, I forget who it was. I was trying to locate this quotation, but there's this wonderful line about populism. Why do we have populism now? And this line goes something like, there is populism because there is no people, right? There is no people. Now, let's unpack this thought for a couple of seconds, and I'll sort of round up the discussion here. So the place where I slightly perhaps disagree with your diagnosis, I think, a wonderful diagnosis, is I think you're right in thinking that we have to locate this current crisis in these deeper economic and social currents. I'm not entirely convinced that income level or variation in economic fortune is largely the explanatory variable that explains this current crisis. Think of the contrast between Spain and Poland, for example. Think of the rise of populist parties and populist groups in Denmark and Sweden. I'm actually not even entirely convinced that the reaction to immigration is actually the main story. In fact, if there is a glimmer of optimism, I think despite Brexit, despite what's going on in the United States, I think it's actually hard to make the case that the United States is more racist, more xenophobic than it was 15, 20 years ago. I mean, there are serious problems. But in a longer run historical perspective, it's actually much more difficult to make the case, I think, that on these parameters, there is some form of decline, right? I'm not even entirely convinced that globalization is part of this story. I think you're right, exactly, that there is a group of people, particularly the middle and lower middle, that are significant losers out of the economic processes. And I think one of the challenges for the left in the first world is that it has to simply face up to this reality. That much of what I see in leftist discourse in America, in Europe, is actually trying to preserve first world privilege against exactly those extraordinary developments in global redistribution that you actually talked about. You read every account of neoliberalism in the last 30 years. Gary Gerstl's recent book, wonderful history in some senses. Not a word about the rest of the world. How come this period of 25, 30 years, which is the most astonishing period in world history for lifting people out of poverty, is seen by the American liberals and American left as this moment of great lamentation of a world that was lost, right? And I'm not even sure that's actually the issue in politics. I think what's going on, and this is a kind of hypothesis, which is there is a loss of community, absolutely, right? There are broken communities. The opioid crisis, for example, here is, I think, that matches onto voting patterns very powerfully. But is that loss of community simply a reaction to immigration, changes in globalization? Or is that a far deeper cultural change? The kind that perhaps the conservative critics like Christopher Lasch, right? That there is a kind of individualism and narcissism kind of gone rampant. That there is actually a lack of genuine social community. It's actually those quotidian forms of solidarity that are actually more at issue, and the kinds of economic policies that make those quotidian forms of social solidarity actually much more difficult, right? And I think a lot turns on this diagnosis because you end with this thing, maybe the Ukraine war will energize solidarity, right? Right? I'm not sure nationalist solidarity what we want is the form of solidarity that can actually create quotidian forms of mutuality and reciprocity. Just to take another example, I was just sort of teaching Bell Hooks, and I was actually struck reading Bell Hooks, how her diagnosis of what's wrong with America was actually also almost at that level, that it's actually these quotidian forms of community, reciprocity, and solidarity that the structures of governance actually make difficult. And if these three claims that I've been making about the endogeneity of institutions to social processes, about the nature and character of elites being the more larger story in the destruction of institutions, and the search for a development model both in the developed world and the developing world that can make quotidian forms of community possible, if these three, and these are all taken from your book, are actually the main drivers, then is simply institutional tinkering going to be enough? Or are we stuck with, as Alasdair MacIntyre says, our debate will oscillate between Trotsky and Saint Benedict, or Hugo Chavez and Adrian Vermeule, if that's your preferred version of the two. And most of us, innocent-minded institutionalists, are going to be swept off our feet by one or the other side.
Okay, I will not try to respond. That's wonderful, Pratap. Thank you so much. So let me say a few things, and then we can open this up, or you can jump in. So let's start with the Burkean point. There's always a problem with any lament of what has passed, and the Burkean insight is simply that there should be a presumption in favor of what has been stable over time, and recognize that it can't last forever. All right. What do we do with that? So where I end up the book, which is what you were getting to at the end, Pratap, is I'm not sure that we can salvage these institutions. So I don't think that that's directed as a critique of me. It's that because I have very little confidence. What I end up saying is there are certain things that are done in any given society that may accelerate the trend of the destruction of the institutions. And until new forms of popular organization are found, we should do what we can to decelerate that. And so on the question of political parties, I think it's over. I do not think that we can reestablish the mass-based political parties that have a way of organizing social life so that you get these quotidian forms of solidarity as you reference. I learned at lunch today that in Finland, you still have youth organizations affiliated with the Social Democratic Party. I was shocked because those have disappeared everywhere else in the world. We don't have those kind of mass-based institutions. So the question is, I think the real question, and this is then now to push back at you, the real question is not will these other institutions come back, but what will be the new form of democratic politics, if there is a new form of democratic politics, because my assessment is that what sustained the expansion and solidification of democracy over the 19th and 20th century was we found a particularly good way of organizing democratic politics that allowed both for inclusion and for elite commitments to long-term play and for mechanisms of compromised social policy to emerge. And that was largely through the institutions of political parties. If we take those away and we move toward plebiscitary models, we'll end up with 5-star. If we move toward popular consultation, Helene Langmore may argue the contrary, but if we move in that direction, we will end up with Chavez-style regimes. And so for me, the question, which I don't try to answer in this book, is what will be the new form of the organization of democratic politics? Because I, like you, am skeptical that much as we may validate what came in the past, I say in the book, this is not an attractive normative model. I mean, Richard Daley's Chicago, Boss Tweed's New York, it looks good right now. But boy, if we lived under it, we would say corruption, deception, sort of semi-violence around the edges. I tell when I was growing up in the United States and then later on, and people say, well, explain to me what this Peronism in Argentina, what is it really? How do we understand it? And my answer was, imagine that Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters ran the United States. That's Peronism, right? There would be more concerns for social welfare. There would be an effort to uplift the lower classes. And at the same time, there would be massive corruption. There would be violence either around the edges or at the core. There would be compromise of public integrity. And that's what these new forms of populist control have. Now, what's the obstacle to that? And you raise many interesting questions. One is to say, well, let's bring back the institutions from before. And that's kind of, my analogy that I use in this is that when I was younger, I played a lot of basketball. My great basketball friend is sitting right here in the audience. And the one thing that's true of old people who played basketball is the older I get, the better I was. And the political parties are kind of the same thing. They look good now, but and oddly, the only country that has managed in this populist moment to really reestablish something that looks recognizably like political party is the BJP. And it's, the BJP has done one great thing as far as I'm concerned. It made it possible in the but-for sense for Pratap to be here with us today by driving him out of India. But that's kind of not a program you want to advance as an affirmative view of the world. But so on that score, what's the answer then? And oddly, you focus on something that is at the heart of a book by Tom Ginsburg and Assis Huck on how to save a democracy. They try to find some empirical basis for how things went right in some places. They find 13 countries that went to the abyss and then pulled back. And what they find basically is it's the center-right elites that pulled it back at each point, that managed to say, okay, we're going to forego momentary advantage in favor of a deeper institutional commitment. So the answer is it has happened, or at least on Tom and Assis's telling, it has happened. But is that enough? Will that be enough? I don't know. I'm not sure. And your last point on, the economics maybe are not what drive this. Maybe it's a loss of cultural sense of engagement in various ways, whether it's the Bob Putnam sense of bowling alone or things like that. I sort of think that, I'd like to think, that if we had better policies for taking care of people within our society, and I agree with you fully at this point that you read this neoliberal stuff and it's the demise of America when America was consuming half the world's resources. It's morally unjust. You can't make that argument morally. So the question then becomes, how do you diffuse it in the advanced countries that are now the focus of this populist fervor? I hope that more rational economic distribution, I hope that showing government competence in improving the material conditions of people's lives. Certainly, this is what Biden staked himself on. This is what Schroeder staked himself on. Will they succeed? I don't know. And then finally, for me, I think the saddest day of my, adult intellectual life was when enlightenment became a term not of the highest aspiration for how we think about the world, but a pejorative. And you're poking fun at me because you know that about me. And yes, I hearken back to Enlightenment values. I like reason, I like order, I like procedural limitations on the exercise of power. I like predictability. Guilty.
I really can't add much to this fantastic interchange, but I did have a couple thoughts, Sam, and you actually, where you ended is the point that I wanted to press you on, which is the chicken and egg question. So that the elephant graph, which is really quite striking, points out, as you said, that the sort of working to middle classes in advanced democracies, in advanced economies rather, in this long run-up of massive wealth creation around the world, seem to have come out on the short end. And globalization, increased free trade, and the like that helped to destroy industrial sectors in the global north, the economies that were affected by that, and then the communities affected by that. I think your story is directly led into our sort of populist moment, at least in the advanced economies. But of course, one way of thinking about free trade is that it makes us richer. And then redistribution of that wealth is a question of how the political system works, and that a political system that was truly responsive long ago would have avoided these types of deprivations, so that there was some political flaw, something in the system already that was not quite ticking correctly, that led to the deprivation that then led to the further calls for a Trump to come along and the like. And so if you flip cause and effect, isn't that really the better way of understanding what's happening? It's the material consequences are really a consequence of political decisions on the part of those in leadership, and I'm talking now about the advanced economies of the world. And then the other, which your glimmer of hope, I wanted to point out one thing about your glimmer of hope. It really does force us to think again about the idea of external threat and external example that we can react against. And if you think back to the Cold War era, one organizing principle in the West was that we weren't them. There was maybe this is a little slice of Schmidt in the air, but there was this other way of organizing the world, organizing your municipal governance affairs that we didn't like and we didn't want, and that brought us together as well. And that it's really having some other model out there to look at, to see, to compare, and then potentially to fail, that reinforces democracy here in the liberal world.
On the second one, I fully agree that the other was there, and one of the difficulties right now is that populists, they won by our rules, and for the most part, they win fair and square. As fair, yeah, they initially win fair and square, and fair and square good enough for government work. They got there. They won the elections. They learned how to play the game, and they came out ahead. So we don't have the other as the model any longer, unless the other is China and Singapore. Highly statified institutional settings with competent leadership. And if that's the model that prevails, that's the end of the democratic experiment, right? But the chicken and egg thing, it's a really hard thing because, before you want to say it's not the chicken, it's the egg, and I want to say that, but even before that egg, there was a chicken, and we can go many steps in this game.
But before that chicken.
Yes, and it's turtles all the way down, but somehow the analogy got mixed up. So I would say the following. Why was it in the period of post-industrial revolution, economic expansion in the Western democracies, and of course the democracies come into play at different times in different countries, but why was there generally a welfarist commitment? Why was there generally the adoption of pension insurance? Why was there health insurance provided? Why this is my son, and he is going to pick up my grandson, so he better get there in time. Why was there this commitment to redistribution, even when the conservatives took power, right? The Republicans in office never tried to dismantle Social Security. The Tories in office never tried to dismantle the National Health Plan, or anything. Why? Well, in part because there were strong trade unions. And why were there strong trade unions? Because there was a strong economic foundation. So I'm you know, I don't want to quite buy your exogeneity argument too much, because they are interrelated, cause and effect here. It's a complicated story. I don't want to rest on what the answer is. I mean, my argument doesn't rest on what the right causal moment, original moment is. My argument is we have to recognize that however this interaction developed, these foundations were necessary for the kind of democratic stability that we thought we had acquired, or if you follow Frank Fukuyama, permanently at the end of the 20th century.
So I think we can move to questions from the floor. Joseph.
So, first I want to say that in the literature on populism, there's a tendency to try and generalize. And there are different forms of populism. And I also should say I have not read the book, but I think I've read 2 papers which were in the making of the book.
Presented in your seminar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So on one of your points, I want to add something that I think you don't see fully, and I also want to point out what I think is one blind point. So the way you explain it, you say democracy brought prosperity, but there was this dip of, so a kind of unequitable distribution of the deserts of globalism and of democracy in a profound way. And in the way you present it, so you say that is the main engine towards this resentment that breeds populism. And I'm sure there's a lot of truth in that. But I think it goes deeper, because what I consider the weakness in that type of analysis, that it's entirely within the current social science paradigm, that it's all about money and power. But not on bread alone does man liveth. And something more interesting is happening here. Because think at the turn of the 20th century, or the end of the 19th century, massive unequal distribution of wealth and power. So one solution was the Russian Revolution. A revolution. We're going to take away the power and the wealth and distribute it. If I want to be cynical, I could say democracy was smarter. You don't need a revolution. Look, we moved from democracy exactly to democracy in that period, and you will see that prosperity could be earned by everybody, which did not happen. But psychologically and sociologically, what happens, if wealth and power can be gained by everybody, equal opportunity, not equal desert, that's the big difference between the Marxist and the liberal solution. The people who don't make it, they feel failures, because everybody can get it, and if I'm not getting it, it's because I'm not good enough, I didn't work enough, etc., which we all know is untrue. They lose self-respect. They feel disrespected in the society, both by those who did make it, and also towards themselves. And when you look at some of the literature of populism, this lack of respect, which, for example, Make America Great appeals to that. It's not a redistribution method. It's, I will make you feel good about yourself. So I think that has to be, it's a serious mobilizing force of populism, to which one little nuance I would add, that the nature of elite has changed also directly from money and power, which is education. And one of the differences between those who enjoy the deserts is also educational. And that enhances even further the sense of lack of self-worth, disrespect. In my society, I'm not respected. And we have contempt for them, because a lot of the analysis of populism never looks in the mirror and said, so where did we in liberal democracy get it wrong, except in a redistribution sense, but not in these other senses. And that's why I said, not on bread alone does man liveth, because these are very important factors in explaining human behavior. That's where I think it's not contradicting what you're saying, but it's just trying to go even deeper. Where you have a blind spot is religion. And religion is important because if you look at many populist phenomena, it's like I didn't notice corruption. It's the United States, it's Israel, it's Poland, and the list goes on. So it's not exactly a religious world, or you could say the impact of secularism or secularization, especially of elites. The battlegrounds that are drawn in this populist society that I mentioned, where suddenly you see the cleavage between populists and liberals, is not only economic, it's also in terms, it's about secularism, religion. Once again, they feel disrespected. It's not because we say, well, we have freedom of religion. Nobody prevents you from going and worshiping. You can be in church from the morning till the evening. It's a liberal democracy. You're free to do that. But there's a certain element of disrespect. One of my colleagues once met me in the corridor here, a colleague I love and he loves me, and he said, Weiler, how can such an intelligent person like yourself be religious? And then he said, well, come to think about it, my most intelligent friends are religious. I'm giving this as a joke, but it actually happened. But I want to say that secularism and religion is also important driving force if you translate it to respect and disrespect.
So on the first point, I fully agree with you. And I think that my book begins with the economics as the foundation for this, but quickly moves beyond it in that sense. And so I have a part where I begin, a chapter where I begin with a passage from this book that I hate called What's the Matter with Kansas? And the thesis of What's the Matter with Kansas is these people are idiots. They don't understand their material interests require them to be just like me. And I open by saying, you're from Cambridge, Massachusetts. What's wrong with Cambridge, Massachusetts? Why aren't you people voting your economic interests if these other people in Kansas are supposed to be doing the same thing? So I agree with that. And in the book, I quote from a wonderful book called The Future of Capitalism by Paul Collier. Paul's a great Oxford economist. And he talks about his life in Oxford and his growing up in Sheffield, which is one of these industrial towns of the Midlands of England. And it's two different worlds. There are people who can, if something goes wrong in England, they can go hop across the channel to Paris and be perfectly happy there and fit right in, and they already know which restaurants and cafes to go to and all that. Or they can stay in London and have Paris come to them, and that's fine. That doesn't happen in Sheffield. It's not that there's a lot of immigrants moving into Sheffield, rather that for the people there, this idea of an alien-looking and sounding London, they call immigration, whether it has to do with immigrants coming and taking their jobs or not. So on that, I fully agree, and I spend much of the book talking about, this is no doubt the influence of too many years with my colleague Jeremy Waldron, of the dignitarian component to a decent modern life. And so on that score, I agree with you. And I may have mispresented. I think I'll defend that the book is sensitive to that issue. Religion's a hard question. I got interested in this topic because the first wave of populism was not in Western Europe, it was in South America. And it was actually interesting, it had a decidedly non-religious component to it. The lines were not drawn over religion. Even to this day, if you go to Mexico, if you go to Chile, or you go to Brazil, you won't find the battle lines drawn over religious identity the way that obviously it is in India, the way that it is in Poland and Israel and so forth. And so you are right that I subsume religion within these other cultural markers that will be different from state to state. And your implicit critique, which I will make explicit, that it's because I am secular and not particularly interested in religious issues that I am inclined toward that. But it never entered your mind. Yeah. You're a man of limited vision, Joseph. I've always said that about you. So on that score, it's something about the a friend of many of us in this room, Roz Dixon, says that whenever I write about any topic in this area, you just have to scratch the surface a little bit and find Peronism as the point of reference. And Peronism has a religious side to it of sorts. The church certainly was complicit, not just with the Peronists, but with the military in Argentina. But it never was the galvanizing principle. You know, it was.
Sam, that's what I said. One has to be attuned to different forms of populism. And the religious thing for me was just a proxy for another form of disrespect.
Yeah.
So in those societies where it's central to the populist divide, they don't care if people are secular. You know, they don't want to go back to the confessional state, but they feel.
That I agree with.
That was the point I was
yeah,
trying
I
to
take
make,
that
maybe
point.
not successfully.
I take that point, and I can't argue against that. It's a central point of identity, and it's as central as I'm an American and I live in this town, and it used to be a good working town, and now look what's happened to it. Points of identity and dignity that flow from that, I fully accept that.
Ron.
So I haven't read the book yet. I much look forward to it. Congratulations. But just listening to some of the description of what you're presenting, I really wonder about Canada because my sense is that for better or worse, party politics in Canada is working much the way that it's worked for probably a century. And though there have been, kind of populist or splitter parties like the Social Credit or the Reform, they usually have not lasted a terribly long period of time. We've had, both right-wing and agrarian left populist governments at the provincial level. They come and go, but within a basic stability of institutions. And yet, Canada is divided along the English-French lines. We have serious issues with Aboriginal peoples, and we have serious regional economic disparities. But the basic institutions seem to hold, and the Liberal Party remains the governing party of Canada, and it basically, and I've spent a lot of time in it and with people in it, operates much the way that I remember when I was a young government official, 40 years ago. So why is Canada, not subject to these terrible developments and pressures? It's a country open to the world, heavily dependent on trade
And immigration.
and immigration. Yeah.
We had a panel here a few years back on a book on, comparative democratic orders and all that. And one of the commentators was Ron Herschel, who's Canadian, or in the same sense that I'm American. I mean, he's got one foot in that country at least. And his analysis was the following. Canada's just made up of very nice people. And and I'm not sure I have much to add to that. I don't purport that this is an invariable law of history that's playing out here, that it has to be the same thing. But even Canadians, and here, obviously, to argue with you, Rob, on Canada is a fraught enterprise, but even my Canadian colleagues will say that there has been a shift toward more power in the hands of the Prime Minister and away from the Parliament, even within Canada. So that the claim is not necessarily that these things have to lead to populism, but that populism is fueled in country after country by a decline in institutional capabilities, resisting sort of the maximal leader. And if the maximal leader is Justin Trudeau, he's a decent guy. If the maximal leader is Macron, he's basically a decent guy from what I can tell. If the maximal leader is Chavez, then the world starts looking a little different. So I can't explain the Canadian rootedness of party. It always has been different from every other first past the post country because of the strength of regional governments and regional parties. I can't answer. I don't know enough about Canada to say. I mean, maybe you do. You have a sense. I just don't know the answer.
Sam, I want to ask you how you think about polarization and institutions. So, and where do you think the causal arrow kind of lies? Do you think the polarization reflects in institutions or it's the other way around? And just to sort of pose a part of this question to you, Pratap, do you think of India as a polarized country? And how should we think about polarization in a place like India where it doesn't neatly cleave into two parties? So there are multiple regional, linguistic, and cultural identities.
You want to go first? Go ahead.
No, you go first.
We are in a period, let's take the United States, we are in a period of heightened polarization. There's no question about that. By every social science metric, we have more polarization. But we've had it in the past. It's not like our polarization levels today are unprecedented. We had what the Irish would call some troubles in the mid-19th century that yielded 600,000 dead. So it's not that we have not experienced this before. What's different, I think, now is the inability of our institutions to channel that. And certainly it broke down in the 1860s, and we had a civil war, and it nearly broke down in the 1930s again. But we've been able to channel it relatively successfully. Now, why the institutions can't channel it, it's a very complicated issue. One of the most depressing claims for me is that the reason they can't is because the parties are in equipoise, basically, politically, and either one can win at any point. So if you look back at the great American century where deals got done and, and everybody got a little piece of the pork and all this sort of stuff, it was always based on the Democratic Party controlling the legislature and the Republicans being supplicants. And the Republicans knowing that they could never take over the House. They could win the presidency, but they couldn't go very far. Now, all of a sudden, both parties believe that in any given election, they can win either branch of government or the presidency, which means the best thing you have going for you going into the next election is, look at Obama, he didn't get anything done. Look at Trump, he didn't get anything done. Look at Biden. And at that point, government becomes not a positive sum game, but becomes all of a sudden a question of these, almost tribal antagonisms. I have a quote in the book I don't know why, unpublished paper by Jeff Sachs. This is somebody who's not shy about publishing. But, and I didn't say that if it's being recorded. But Jeff makes a distinction between policies that are distributive and policies that are redistributive. And the distinction is, distribution is, this is all we got. And either I'm going to get 4 slices of the pie or you're going to get 5, and that's all there is. Whereas redistribution is the idea that, okay, we're going to fight over the allocation, but we're all in this together to make the pie bigger in some sense. And I think that populism has that strong element of distribution, not redistribution. There's no forward-looking. So I'm not a fan of modern monetary theory. My view of it is basically you're just redescribing Argentine fiscal policy my whole life. And Argentina today has the same per capita income that it did when I was born. It has not improved at all. And it is a question of just grabbing what's there and giving it out. When that's the game, polarization can't get channeled. So that's my main argument.
So I think a couple of distinctions in this, right? And so there's one form of polarization that you worry about, which is in relation to institutions, right? Which is to say, are all parties that are playing that game and all social forces, are they committed to a basic set of norms about peaceful turnover of power and stuff? And I think one of the things that Sam is actually worried about is that's very specific form of polarization, right? Where there's a group in society now willing to say, or a party or some force, right, that we will no longer obey these norms and rules. It's okay to go after political opponents. It's okay to make sure that the machinery of elections is subverted, right? So that's one kind of polarization, which is, you might say, polarization around the value of this common institutional life that we have defined in terms of procedures and stuff. And in that sense, you can actually argue India is at that critical moment where there is that polarization, that you cannot take for granted that the kinds of regimes that we have will be committed to the same transitions, peaceful transitions of power that we are used to, right? And that's really the existential one that I think Sam is right. There's a second one which, historically, when we speak of polarization, we used to think of polarization around lines of identity politics, right? Ethnic exclusion, communalism. I don't think India is an outlier in that. I mean, I think what's going on in India at one level is the BJP's project is to try and convert India into a European-style nation state in a context where the consequences of doing that would be catastrophic. But it is actually following that same trajectory, right? That every nation state in the process of its formation has been majoritarian and exclusionary. There's no single exception to this, right? And in some senses, what we thought, right, post-independence 1951, that India would sort of buck that trend, given the horrors of partition, that there's an imagining of a different kind of nation state, right? But actually, in some senses, I think what the BJP is doing is kind of reverting back to the mean, which is also what makes it political. It's exactly the same trajectory Europe went through in the 19th century. It's exactly the same trajectory the United States, in some senses, did. And that axis of polarization, right? Who gets included and excluded as equals within the community, right? That's a long-running, in some senses, argument. The third axis is the distribution one that Sam talked about. And I think most political scientists would argue that other than the expropriation of land, right, in the context of land reform in different countries in the 1940s, 50s, actually most forms of distribution that democracies do are actually distributions, not redistributions. In fact, the coalition works, the center-right commits to the welfare state, in part because they realize that this actually does not materially affect the foundations of their own power. Bismarck becomes an advocate of basic income to outflank labor. I mean, this is kind of standard. Even Lula, right? I mean, this kind of great sort of left social democratic moment. The description of Lula was this was distribution without redistribution. You basically have a global commodity boom. There's lots of export money to have. You run a welfare program. And by the way, for developing countries, for countries like India, right, the most remarkable thing about the last 20 years is the biggest expansion of welfare in their history. So you are actually getting distribution without. The biggest expansion of state capacity, right? Something Sam, in a sense, kind of touches upon. And so I think on that dimension, I don't see the polarization quite in the same way as it's happening here.
So before just one comment for Madhav. You persuaded me, I can't remember, we were having dinner somewhere, someplace, I don't know what country or where, but that there's the cosmopolitan side of life. But you persuaded me that India has always had a reserve state capability that those on the outside didn't observe, because we look at how are the roads, how are the sewers, things of that sort. But every couple of years it has religious gatherings of millions of people, and it manages to pull off these kinds. So there is, even in India, there's this reserve state capability that you've always insisted on.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize. Can I just say one point about state capability, because I think it's very important to your book. So Sam's description of kind of the state capacity chapter is fantastic with all these pictures of airports and stuff. But I think there's one thing interesting we've learned in the last couple of years, maybe much more so, is it's very hard to specify state capacity as an independent variable, independent of the social forces which it is embedded. So when I look at the kinds of state incapacity that Sam is talking about in the United States, right? The inability to build the airport, the extension of the subway, right? Frankly, the whole world could have been vaccinated for actually literally peanuts, right? Didn't happen. I think it's interesting to diagnose where does that state incapacity come from. And one of the things that I think makes the US context interesting is that on the state capacity point, it's not easy to differentiate the two political parties. Both have significant governance failures of their own, right? I mean, which is why Democrats are in danger of losing. New York and California are not poster childs of governance at the moment, right? And is it the case that the US state incapacity that you've seen, right? So one explanation is this is all capitalism unwilling to redistribute and invest in the state. There's another Republican counter-narrative. This is liberals who want to insure against every risk, and law professors who have created such arcane regulations that absolutely nothing can get done, right? Just wanted to check, what's your diagnosis? It probably is a bit of both, but...
It's both, yeah. I think I put forward both.
Right, yeah. But that's what makes the politics of state incapacity so much more complicated in the US.
Right, that's why I don't have a
Yeah.
2-point program.
Exactly.
So Sam, I love the book, and of course every line I read the footnote, and there are 5 more books you've asked us to read. So it's terrific, it's great. I had 2 thoughts that I'd love to hear you more, to sort of say more about. One is, I was wondering if you could say a little bit about information and knowledge and expertise, because there's a lot of that, as you know, on the writings on populism, but less in the book. And so I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about where you see some of those questions. And I mean, it cuts across in many ways, right? And the second is, I had a thought that was similar to Joseph's, but in my mind, it had a more invidious bent, which is I see the challenge of negotiating questions of religion or identity even, right? And the last thing one wants to do is collapse into a certain kind of Orientalist description and think that political imagination in these different countries is limited by, say, a theological horizon or something like that. But how do you think about not the psychology of self-respect, which is what Joseph was interested in, but just the psychology of prejudice, like just brutal prejudice, which is slightly different, right? Because in the first part of the book, there is still a kind of liberal liberal undercurrent of trying to unpack why people went in this direction. But there's a part of me thinks that are we almost trying to be like trying to argue with people when the conditions for communicative rationality are not present?
Yeah, so this goes back to, I don't think enlightenment is a pejorative term. Yes, I wanted, and maybe I overdid it, I wanted to remove myself from the discussion of the venality of the populist rhetoric. I didn't want to focus on that. So there is, I have to acknowledge it, obviously, I'm not blind, but I did not focus. And notice in the discussion today, the word Trump has only come up once so far, which I think to be a great achievement of this book. You know, if I can keep that as the sideshow and not the main story. So I don't focus on it, the venality part of it. It's obviously there. And what, you know, you want to accuse me of liberalism, but what people like me can't quite explain and don't really feel comfortable discussing is why is it so easy to tap? right? Why is it that, how did Hinduism become this rallying cry for intolerance? And so why was that, why was that so easily done? I just read the autobiography of, famous Indian economist, obviously, and he was talking about I think it was his uncle, his
grandfather.
his grandfather. What?
Amartya's
Yeah, Amartya's grandfather. This is Amartya Sen, but his grandfather, who was a translator of older Hindu texts that drew on Muslim imagery and Muslim stories and all this, and was trying to negate the early kind of Hinduist nationalist fervor that was being developed. And I don't have an answer for why it's so easily tapped. It's not clear how quickly, it's not clear to me why it was so easy and so quick to get Serbs and Croats to go after each other in Bosnia. Because after 2 generations under Tito, basically, they had intermarried, you had to do a lot of work to recreate those kind of animosity. I don't have an answer for that. But again, if you start from where I started getting into this, from the South American perspective, these communal issues, at least in the southern part of South America, don't have this element to it. When you get to Peru, when you get up north and you have the racial, the indigenous question, then it has more of this. But at least in the early manifestations in the southern part of South America, it didn't. The other part of your question is, I don't have a strong discussion of this point either, which is how this translates into anti-science, anti-rationality, but it's obviously there, and I address it in part, but not very well.
So I know there are a couple other questions, but we have time for. I want to leave time for a reception and for a little mingling. So I will call a close. But before we end, I just want to say again, this is really a thought-provoking, provocative book. It reflects everything that we love about Sam and his work. And I want to thank Sam and Pratap for their discussion today.